Number 10. John Ernest. It was the last day of Passover, a morning meant for prayer and tradition. Inside the Chabad of Poway Synagogue in South Carolina, families had gathered for a holiday service, not knowing they were about to become the center of a hate-fueled attack. John Ernest was 19 years old when he drove to the synagogue on April 27, 2019. From the outside, he looked like an ordinary college student from the San Diego area. Online, investigators found a very different picture. A young man steeped in extremist material, radicalized to the point of seeing worshippers as targets. The Poway attack wasn't his first act of violence. About a month earlier, on March 24, 2019, Ernest had attempted to set fire to the Dar al-Arqam Mosque in Escondido. No one was hurt, and the connection to Ernest wasn't understood until after the synagogue attack revealed the pattern. Inside Chabad of Poway that April morning, the service turned to chaos within moments of Ernest entering. Lori Gilbert Kay was killed. 3 others were injured, including the rabbi, an 8-year-old child, and the child's uncle. The attack could have been far worse. A worshiper named Oscar Stewart moved towards Ernest, and an off-duty Border Patrol agent also responded. Ernest fled, called emergency services himself, and admitted what he'd done. Police took him into custody, and investigators soon linked the synagogue shooting to the earlier mosque fire. Unlike most cases in this countdown, Ernest lived to face the courts. In state court, he pled guilty in 2021 to charges tied to both the synagogue attack and the mosque fire, receiving life without parole. In federal court, he pled guilty to a 113-count hate crime indictment, covering the killing, the attempted killings, the attack on a place of worship, and the arson. In December 2021, a federal judge added life plus 30 years, ordered to run consecutively to the state sentence, a symbolic decision meant to show that both the Jewish and Muslim communities he targeted mattered equally in the eyes of the law. John Ernest is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. There will be no release date, no parole hearing, no path back to public life. The case became part of a larger national reckoning over online radicalization and security at houses of worship. It raised a question that still lingers. What does someone read, watch, and absorb until strangers become enemies in their mind? Worshippers walked into Chabad of Poway that morning, expecting nothing more than prayer. By the time the service should have ended, a sacred space had become a symbol of how quickly hatred, left unchecked online, can walk through the front door of a community built on peace. Number 9. Robert Aaron Long. The attacks began on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in places nobody expected to become national headlines. Small businesses and strip malls along familiar Georgia roads. On March 16, 2021, 3 Atlanta-area spas became the center of a tragedy that shook the state and sparked a national conversation about bias and vulnerability. Robert Aaron Long was 21, raised in Woodstock, Georgia, in a conservative religious household. On the surface, his life looked quiet and unremarkable. Beneath it, he later told investigators, was turmoil. Personal compulsions, guilt, and shame, he said, were unrelated to race. Many questioned that explanation immediately. 6 of the 8 victims were women of Asian descent, and the attack came during a period of rising fear in Asian American communities nationwide. The violence began in Cherokee County. Long purchased a handgun that afternoon and drove to Young's Asian Massage near Ackworth, where he killed 4 people. Jiajie Emily, Dao Yufeng, Delana Youn, and Paul Mickles. He didn't stop there. He drove roughly 30 miles into Atlanta, killing 3 more, Soon-Sha Kim, Soon-Chung Park, and Hyun-Jung Grant at Gold Spa, then crossed the street to Aromatherapy Spa and killed Yang A.U. 8 lives, 3 locations, one afternoon. Long's own parents recognized him from released surveillance images and contacted police, reportedly helping track his phone. He was stopped on Interstate 75 in Crisp County, more than 100 miles south of Atlanta. Investigators later said he indicated plans to continue the attacks in Florida, meaning Georgia may have only been the beginning of what he intended. The case split into two legal tracks. In Cherokee County, Long pleaded guilty in July 2021 to the 4 Ackworth killings and received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 35 additional years, guaranteeing he'd never leave prison. In Fulton County, prosecutors pursued the death penalty along with hate crime enhancements for the 4 Atlanta deaths, and Long pleaded not guilty. That case moved far more slowly, in part because Georgia law requires a hate crime enhancement to be argued only after a conviction on the underlying charge. For families and advocates, the question of bias mattered deeply. Even if Long denied race was his motive, the victims, the locations, and the national climate made it impossible for many to separate the crime from identity. As of 2026, Long is already serving life without parole for the Cherokee County killings, while the Fulton County death penalty case remains pending, tied up in hearings over defense representation. His status is unfinished, a convicted killer already locked away for life and still a defendant in a case that hasn't reached its final verdict. The case remains, for many, an unresolved reckoning between an explanation and the scale of what was lost.
Number 8. Mauricio Garcia. It was a Saturday built around ordinary plans: families shopping, parents walking with kids, workers helping customers. Within minutes, Allen Premium Outlets in North Texas became a place no one there would forget. Mauricio Garcia was 33, from the Dallas area, living out of a motel after time with his parents, with a background in security work. Nothing about him stood out publicly. Online, though, investigators found a trail of extremist material, neo-Nazi references, white supremacist content, and years of collected hatred pointed at multiple groups. There wasn't one clean motive, instead a mixture of hate, isolation, and obsession. The attack showed clear signs of planning. Investigators found evidence Garcia had studied the mall's layout and busy hours in advance, treating the space not as a shopper, but as a target to calculate. On May 6, 2023, around 3:36 p.m., Mauricio Garcia stepped out of his vehicle near the shopping area and opened fire. The open-air mall offered no single safe space, only split-second choices as employees pulled customers into back rooms and families scattered between stores. 8 people died, 7 were injured. Victims included adults and children, workers and shoppers, among them security guard Christian LaCour and members of a family who had come to the mall together. What kept the toll from rising further was proximity. An Allen police officer happened to be nearby on an unrelated call, heard the gunfire, and moved toward it immediately. Within minutes, he confronted and stopped Garcia, who died at the scene. Because Garcia didn't survive, there was no arrest, no trial, no verdict, only an investigation to reconstruct what led to that afternoon. The authorities searched his home, vehicle, and digital accounts, finding weapons, tactical gear, and extremist material, along with a brief 2008 stint in the Army that ended over mental health concerns. Even with everything uncovered, the motive resisted a single explanation. He held extremist beliefs, researched the location, and prepared, but investigators couldn't say definitively whether specific people were the target or whether the mall itself was simply chosen for its crowds and open layout. Garcia's legal status ended at the scene. But the case continued in civil court as families filed lawsuits against the mall's ownership, its security contractor, Garcia's estate, and the motel where he'd stayed, arguing more could have been done to prevent the attack. Allen Premium Outlets wasn't remote or hidden. It was an ordinary weekend destination, the kind of place families visited without a second thought. Mauricio Garcia turned it into a lasting symbol of how many warning signs can sit in plain sight before anyone connects them, and how quickly online hatred can translate into a real-world plan.
Number 7. Connor Stephen Betts. The entire attack lasted about 32 seconds, less time than it takes to order a drink. In that brief window, Dayton, Ohio's Oregon Historic District changed forever. Connor Stephen Betts was 24 when he arrived downtown in the early hours of August 4, 2019, blending into a crowd enjoying the last stretch of a summer Saturday night. He'd grown up nearby, attended Bellbrook High School, and was remembered by classmates as complicated, sometimes social, sometimes disturbing. Investigators later learned his fascination with mass violence had lasted roughly a decade, layered with mental health stressors and violent fantasies, though no one around him had heard a specific warning that he was about to act. Betts arrived in the district with his younger sibling and a companion before separating from them. Surveillance footage later let investigators rebuild his movements minute by minute. At around 1:05 a.m., he emerged near an alley on East 5th Street and began shooting. People scattered into businesses, behind cars, anywhere that offered distance. In roughly half a minute, 9 people died, including Betts's own sibling. Authorities were never able to determine whether that was intentional. Dozens more were injured. The toll was kept from climbing further because Dayton police were already stationed nearby, given the area's nightlife. 6 officers confronted Betts as he moved toward the packed entrance of Ned Pepper's bar and stopped him before he reached the door, a doorway investigators believe could have meant far greater loss of life. The investigation that followed was extensive. Searches of his home, hundreds of hours of surveillance review, digital forensics, and more than 125 interviews across several states. The FBI and Dayton police ultimately concluded Betts acted alone, without direction from any organization or ideology, driven instead by a long-standing fascination with violence combined with personal stressors, an answer that explained the facts without ever fully satisfying the question of why. Because Betts died at the scene, there was no trial, no conviction, no sentencing. A related case did move through federal court. An associate, Ethan Coley, was found to have helped acquire or store firearms-related equipment and pleaded guilty to lying on a federal firearms form, receiving 32 months in prison in February 2020, evidence that preparation for the attack extended beyond Betts alone. Dayton, already worn down by a difficult year of tornado damage, responded with vigils and memorial funds, but nothing could undo what happened in that half-minute. The Oregon District shooting wasn't a long standoff or drawn-out manhunt. It was 32 seconds, following years of warning signs that never became specific enough for anyone to act on, leaving a wound the city still carries and a question that is never fully closed. Number 6. Ahmed Al-Aliwi Al-Issa. It was the kind of place people walk into without a second thought. A grocery store, a parking lot, a quick stop for dinner. On March 22, 2021, the King Soopers on Table Mesa Drive in Boulder, Colorado became the center of a tragedy the city never expected. Ahmed Al-Aliwi Al-Issa was 21, a Colorado resident with no major public profile before that day. Court records later described serious mental health issues, while prosecutors pointed to clear planning in preparation, a tension between illness and responsibility that would define the years-long trial to come. King Soopers was woven into the daily rhythm of South Boulder, the kind of store where neighbors ran into each other and families picked up birthday cakes. Shortly before 3 p.m., Al-Aliwi began the attack in the parking lot before moving inside, sending customers and employees scrambling for exits, back rooms, and anywhere that felt safer than the open aisles. Boulder police officer Eric Talley, a father of 7, was among the first to respond, running toward the danger as others fled. By the time the attack ended, 10 people were dead.
customers, employees, a repair worker, and Officer Tally himself. Al-Issa was injured during the police response and taken into custody. What followed was one of the most legally complicated cases in this countdown. Investigators confirmed the weapon had been purchased legally just days earlier. Al-Issa was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, along with dozens of additional charges, but the case stalled repeatedly over competency evaluations. For a period, he was ruled unfit to stand trial before later being found competent after treatment. His defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing his mental illness prevented him from understanding right from wrong. Prosecutors didn't dispute his mental illness, but argued his planning and awareness during the attack proved he understood exactly what he was doing. In September 2024, after weeks of testimony, a jury found him guilty on all 55 counts, including all 10 murder charges, rejecting the insanity defense. Because Colorado has no death penalty, the maximum sentence was life without parole. The judge handed down 10 consecutive life sentences, plus more than 1,300 additional years. Ahmed Al-Issa is serving life without the possibility of parole. The case reignited Colorado's fight over firearm regulation. Boulder's earlier attempts to restrict certain weapons had been struck down in court, but after the attack, the state changed law to give local governments more power to legislate beyond state minimums. What lingers is the setting itself, a grocery store, built for routine, transformed into the place an entire community learned to calculate escape routes between the checkout lanes.
Number 5. Who Can Tran? The night was supposed to end in music and celebration. Instead, it became the night Monterey Park, California would never forget. On January 21, 2023, Lunar New Year festivities filled the city's streets. Nearby, at the Star Ballroom Dance Studio, 72-year-old Who Can Tran was preparing to turn the celebration into a tragedy. Tran had once been a familiar face in the local ballroom dance scene. Some remembered him fondly, others as quick-tempered and difficult, before later relocating to a senior community in Hemet. Just after 10 p.m., Tran entered Star Ballroom and opened fire on a room full of dancers, many of them regulars celebrating the holiday. By the time the attack there ended, 11 people were dead and 9 injured. He wasn't finished. Tran drove to a second venue, the Lai Lai Ballroom in Alhambra, where 26-year-old Brandon Tsai was working. When Tran entered armed, Tsai confronted him directly, wrestling the weapon away in a struggle that investigators believe prevented far greater loss of life. Tran fled the scene. What followed was a massive manhunt across Los Angeles County. Police released images of Tran and searched for a white cargo van linked to him. The next day, January 22nd, officers located the van in Torrance, roughly 30 miles away. When SWAT teams moved in, they found Tran dead inside from a self-inflicted wound. There was no arrest, no trial, and ultimately no clear singular motive. Investigators suggested Tran may have held personal grievances tied to the local dance hall community, built up over years, but officials never announced one definitive explanation for why he chose that specific night and those specific people. The lack of a clear motive made the loss harder for the community to process, because the victims weren't abstract headlines. They were parents, grandparents, and dance partners in a community where ballroom dancing served as a hub of friendship and belonging for many older Asian immigrants. The attack landed during Lunar New Year weekend, a holiday centered on renewal and hope, deepening the sense of a sacred moment violated. Who Can Tran's case ended the same way it began, without a courtroom. He died January 22, 2023, and the legal aftermath shifted toward firearm access, emergency response, and unanswered questions about warning signs. What remains is the memory of an ordinary celebration turned into grief. A dance floor built for connection
becoming instead a place a community now associates with loss. And at the center of it, one act of courage from a stranger who refused to let the violence continue into a second room. A reminder that the line between a far worse night and the one that actually happened came down to a single confrontation. Number 4. Aaron Alexis. The place was supposed to be secure, a federal facility, guarded, filled with workers who believed danger lived somewhere outside the gates. On the morning of September 16, 2013, the threat walked into the Washington Navy Yard with a valid pass. Aaron Alexis was 34, a former Navy reservist turned civilian IT contractor. He had credentials, a job assignment, and knowledge of the building, which made what followed even more disturbing. He'd served in the Navy Reserve from 2007 to 2011, and off-duty, people described him as quiet and interested in Buddhism and meditation. But his record included a 2004 arrest for damaging a man's vehicle in a rage, a 2010 firearm incident with a neighbor, and behavioral concerns that led to his exit from the reserve. Despite that history, he kept his secret-level clearance and continued working government IT contracts. Weeks before the attack, the warning signs sharpened. While working in Newport, Rhode Island, Alexis reported paranoid beliefs that people were following him and keeping him awake. Hotel staff, supervisors, police, and medical professionals each touched a piece of the story, but no single report was enough to pull his access before it was too late. On September 16th, Aaron Alexis drove a rented Toyota Prius to the Navy Yard and entered Building 197 around 8:08 a.m. with a backpack. He made his way to the 4th floor where he'd previously worked, and the attack began just after 8:15 a.m. For more than an hour, officers worked through a maze of floors, stairwells, and cubicles, trying to locate him amid chaotic, conflicting reports. By the time law enforcement confronted and fatally wounded Alexis at 9:25 a.m., 12 people were dead and several more injured. Investigators later confirmed he'd legally purchased the shotgun used in the attack just 2 days earlier in Virginia, carrying it into the secure facility, hidden in his belongings. There was no trial. Aaron Alexis died the day of the attack, and the U.S. Attorney's Office later reviewed the responding officers' actions and filed no charges against them. Instead, the aftermath became a public reckoning over federal contractor vetting, security clearances, and insider threat detection. Congressional and Department of Defense reviews pointed to communication failures between the police, medical staff, and employers who each held a fragment of Alexis's deteriorating state. Aaron Alexis's case remains final. He died the day of the attack, but its impact reshaped how federal agencies monitor people who already hold access to sensitive spaces. The Navy Yard attack wasn't an outsider breaking through the gates. It was someone with permission to walk in, whose warning signs were scattered across systems that never spoke to each other, leaving behind the hardest kind of question. How many locked doors matter if the danger is already inside?
Number 3. Dwayne Antonio Craddock. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind where people are already thinking about the weekend. Inside Building 2 of the Virginia Beach Municipal Center, employees were finishing their week until a longtime city engineer made a decision no one saw coming. Dwayne Antonio Craddock, 40, worked in the city's public utilities department. He wasn't an outsider. He knew the hallways, the access points, and the people. Investigators later found no dramatic warning that clearly predicted the attack. Some described him as quiet and isolated, particularly after a divorce, but nothing that stood out as an obvious threat. On March 31, 2019, Craddock arrived at work as usual. Around 10:30 a.m., he emailed his supervisor a routine 2 weeks notice resignation, citing personal reasons, a message that read as completely ordinary.
That afternoon, he visited job sites with 2 coworkers, returned to the building, and sent his final work email at 3:55 p.m. A coworker waved to him near his car around 4 p.m. Minutes later, the attack began outside near the rear entrance before Craddock moved into Building 2, the primary workspace for hundreds of employees in a public-facing civic building serving residents on permits in city business. Emergency calls started at 4:06 p.m. Officers entered by 4:10 p.m. Inside, employees hid in offices, fled through hallways, and made split-second decisions about safety. One employee, Ryan Keith Cox, reportedly gathered coworkers into a secured room, then left to try to help others further away, a choice that captured both the chaos and courage of that afternoon. Police eventually cornered Craddock across multiple levels of the building. A sergeant was struck, but saved by his protective vest. After a confrontation with officers, Craddock was taken into custody injured, received medical aid, and died that evening at 5:26 p.m. 12 people were killed, mostly city employees, along with a contractor who'd come in for a permit. 4 others were seriously injured. Because Craddock died the same day, there was no trial, no charges, no verdict. Investigators spent months searching for a motive, with no note and no clear public explanation. In 2021, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit concluded he appeared driven by long-simmering workplace grievances and a belief that his performance was unfairly judged, though officials acknowledged the limits of certainty since only Craddock knew his own reasoning. A state commission later recommended stronger emergency plans and better victim support, but no policy change could undo the loss. What lingers about this case isn't just what happened, it's how an entirely ordinary Friday, complete with a routine resignation email sent hours beforehand, gave absolutely no indication of what was still to come.
Number 2. Ian David Long. The bar was loud and alive, the kind of college night that felt like one of the safest places in Thousand Oaks. Just before midnight on November 7, 2018, that feeling vanished at Borderline Bar and Grill. Ian David Long was 28, a former Marine who deployed to Afghanistan between 2008 and 2013. His military record suggested discipline. His personal life told a different story. In April 2018, deputies had responded to his Newbury Park home after reports of erratic behavior. A crisis team and mental health professionals spoke with him, but he wasn't placed on an involuntary hold, a decision revisited many times after what followed. That November night, Borderline was hosting its regular college country night, drawing students and locals, some of whom had survived the Route 91 Harvest Festival in Las Vegas just a year earlier and found comfort in Borderline's familiarity. Around 11:20 p.m., Long arrived and opened fire, sending the crowd scrambling, some dropping to the floor, others breaking windows to escape. Ventura County Sheriff Sergeant Ron Hellis, a veteran deputy nearing retirement, was among the first responders, moving in with a California Highway Patrol officer to reach people trapped inside. The attack lasted only minutes, but felt endless to those hiding inside. By the time it ended, 12 people were dead, including Sergeant Hellis. Long was found dead inside from a self-inflicted wound, meaning no arrest, no trial, no testimony, no verdict. Investigators worked to understand why. They knew about his military service and the earlier deputy call to his home, but neither fact alone explained the target. A 2021 investigative report concluded Long likely held deep resentment toward civilians, especially college students, and may have specifically chosen Borderline's college night, knowing it would draw a large crowd of them, though even that conclusion came with acknowledged uncertainty, since Long left behind no note and no clear public explanation of his own. Because Long died at the scene, the legal aftermath focused entirely on the response and the lessons for law enforcement in public venues, rather than a courtroom.
Borderline had been more than a business. It was a gathering place where friendships formed over years of weekly visits. After the attack, that sense of safety was replaced with memorials in grief. Ian David Long didn't just harm the people inside that bar, he broke the sense that familiar places are automatically safe. A dance floor became a crime scene, and a community built around music was left to reckon with how quickly that kind of joy can be taken, and how easily an earlier warning, once dismissed, can look unbearable in hindsight.
Number 1. Robert Card. For almost 2 days, an entire corner of Maine seemed to hold its breath. Doors stayed locked, schools went quiet, and somewhere in the dark, police believed 40-year-old Army reservist Robert Card was still out there. Before October 25, 2023, Card wasn't a household name. He'd spent more than 2 decades in the Army Reserve, giving him an outward image of discipline and control. But in the months before the attack, family members and fellow reservists grew increasingly alarmed by his paranoia and deteriorating mental state. That summer, while his unit was in New York, Card was hospitalized amid concerns about his behavior and access to weapons. Concerns that never translated into lasting restrictions. On the evening of October 25th, Lewiston was having an ordinary night. People bowling, gathered at a bar and grill. At 6:56 p.m., calls came in from Just-in-Time Recreation, a bowling alley on Mollison Street. Minutes later, at 7:08 p.m., more calls came from Shemenji's Bar and Grill, about 4 miles away. By the end of the night, 18 people were dead and 13 injured, the deadliest attack in this countdown and one of the worst in Maine's history. As investigators pieced together what happened, Card vanished and the case shifted from tragedy to manhunt. Residents across Lewiston, Lisbon, and Bowdoin were told to shelter in place while hundreds of officers searched roads, woods, and waterways for 2 days. A vehicle tied to Card was found near a boat landing in Lisbon, deepening the uncertainty over whether he'd escaped by water or was still nearby. On October 27th, the search ended. Robert Card was found dead near a recycling facility in Lisbon where he'd once worked. Police announced an arrest warrant during the manhunt, but because Card died before capture, there was no trial, no conviction, and no sentence, the legal process ending before it could begin. The investigation that followed turned to warning signs. A special commission concluded that local law enforcement and the Army Reserve missed opportunities to intervene, including possible use of Maine's yellow flag law, which allows temporarily removing weapons from someone deemed dangerous. Card's status is final. No appeals, no sentencing. But the aftermath continues through investigations, policy debates, and legal action from survivors who believe officials failed to act on repeated warnings. The hardest question isn't just what happened on October 25th, it's what happened before it. How many warnings are enough? How many systems have to fail at once? And how a tragedy this large can leave behind no defendant and no final courtroom answer. Only a community rebuilding around a silence that may never fully close.